across the endless steppes where earth meets heaven, where wind carries the whispers of ancestors and grass bends beneath the weight of destiny. There once walked a child who would reshape the world. In that vast silence between mountain and sky, where wolves howl ancient songs and eagles circle like omens, a name would rise that would echo through centuries like thunder across the plains. Here, beneath stars that have watched empires crumble to dust, begins the story of a boy who became the storm itself, a tale of blood and brotherhood, of tribes united under one banner, of a man who carved his legacy not in stone, but in the very fabric of human memory. Listen now, as the steppes remember, as the wind recalls, as history unfolds like a scroll written in starlight and sealed with the breath of eternity. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. In the year 1162, when the world beyond the steppes knew nothing of the storm gathering in the heart of Mongolia, a child was born beneath the eternal blue sky that the Mongols called Tengri. The birth came not in palaces or cities, but in a felt tent pitched beside the Anan River, where the grass grew thick and the horses drank from waters that reflected clouds like wandering sheep. His father, Yasuge, was a chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a man whose reputation rode the wind from tribe to tribe. Strong of arm and keen of eye, Yasuge possessed that quality the Mongols prized above all others, the ability to unite men under his banner through a combination of strength, wisdom, and the mysterious quality they called Su, the spiritual power that marked true leaders. His wife Hollum came from the Olkona tribe, taken in the traditional manner of the steppes through capture and subsequent acceptance, a practice that bound tribes together through blood and alliance. The child who emerged into this world of wind and grass bore a sign that the shamans would whisper about for years to come. In his tiny fist, he clutched a clot of blood, dark as the earth after rain, firm as stone. The wise women who attended the birth exchanged glances heavy with meaning. Blood in the fist of a newborn spoke of a life destined for conquest, of hands that would hold the reins of power, of a future written in the language of war and victory. They named him Temujin, after a Tatar chieftain whom his father had recently defeated in battle. It was the Mongol way to name children after conquered enemies, believing that the strength of the defeated would flow into the victor's bloodline. The name carried weight. It spoke of triumph, of the cyclical nature of power on the steppes, where today's enemy might become tomorrow's memory, and today's child might become tomorrow's Khan. The world into which Temujin was born was one of constant motion and eternal struggle. The Mongol tribes lived as they had for countless generations, following the rhythm of seasons and the needs of their herds. In spring, they moved their camps to take advantage of fresh grass. Summer found them a traditional gathering grounds where tribes would meet for trade, marriages, and the settling of disputes. Autumn brought preparation for the harsh winter, and winter itself was a test of survival that claimed the weak and strengthened the hardy. The Mongol society was built upon the foundation of the horse and the bow. From the time a child could walk, they were taught to ride. Before they could properly hold a sword, they learned to draw a bowstring. The steppes demanded such skills for survival. Wolves hunted in packs. Rival tribes raided without warning, and the very landscape itself could turn deadly with little notice. A man's worth was measured not in gold or land, but in horses, in the loyalty of his followers, and in his ability to provide for his people through both cunning and strength. Temujin's early years were shaped by the rhythms of nomadic life. He learned to read the sky for weather, to understand the language of animals, to find water where others saw only dry earth. His education came not from books, for the Mongols kept their wisdom in memory and song, but from the daily necessities of survival. He learned which plants could heal and which could kill, how to track game across vast distances, and how to judge the character of men by their actions in crisis. The boy showed early signs of the qualities that would later make him legendary. He possessed an intensity that unsettled adults, a way of looking at the world as if seeing patterns invisible to others. When other children played at herding sheep, Temujin organized them with the precision of a military commander. When disputes arose among the youth, they naturally looked to him for resolution. There was something in his presence that commanded attention, a gravity that seemed too great for such small shoulders. Yet his childhood was far from privileged. The Borjigin clan, while respected, was not among the most powerful on the steppes. They lived constantly aware of stronger neighbors who might decide that the Borjigin grazing lands would serve them better. Yasuge ruled through a combination of diplomatic skill and careful alliance building, always conscious that a single mistake could mean disaster for his people. The steppes operated under a complex web of relationships that could shift like desert sand. Today's ally might become tomorrow's enemy if circumstances changed. Blood feuds could simmer for generations, erupting into violence when least expected. Marriages were political instruments as much as personal choices, designed to bind clans together or create obligations that might prevent conflict. In this world, a leader survived not through brute force alone, but through an intricate understanding of human nature and tribal politics. Temujin absorbed these lessons through observation and experience. He watched his father negotiate with visiting chieftains, noting how Yasuge could be firm without giving offense, generous without appearing weak, decisive without seeming hasty. The boy learned that true strength often lay in restraint, that the greatest victories were sometimes won without drawing a sword. When Temujin reached his 9th year, his father decided it was time to secure an alliance that would strengthen the Borjigin clan's position. Among the Mongol tribes, marriage alliances were often arranged when children were still young, creating bonds that would mature as the children grew. Yasuge had heard of a suitable girl among the Onjarat tribe, a people known for producing beautiful and intelligent women who made strong wives and mothers. The journey to the Onjarat lands took father and son across familiar territory where every hill and valley held memories and meaning. Yasuge used the travel time to share stories and wisdom with his son, speaking of the great khans of the past, of the sacred mountains that touched the sky, of the responsibilities that came with leadership. These conversations on horseback, with the vast steppes stretching endlessly around them, would remain with Temujin for the rest of his life. they found the Anjurat camping near a stream that wound silver through the green grass. The negotiations proceeded according to ancient custom, with much formal courtesy and indirect discussion before arriving at the heart of the matter. The girl in question was Börte, daughter of Day Sechin, a respected elder of the tribe. She was perhaps a year older than Temujin, with intelligent eyes and a bearing that suggested both gentleness and strength. The first meeting between the children was conducted under the watchful eyes of their elders. Börte showed no shyness, meeting Temujin's gaze directly and answering his simple questions with thoughtful responses. There was an understanding between them that transcended their youth, perhaps a recognition that their lives were being bound together by forces greater than personal choice, but that within those constraints, mutual respect and eventual affection might grow. Day Sechin found Yasuge's proposal acceptable. The alliance would benefit both clans, and the children seemed well matched in temperament. According to tradition, Temujin would remain with the Anjurat for a time, learning their ways and allowing the betrothal to solidify. Yasuge prepared to return to his own people, confident that he had secured a valuable alliance and a suitable future for his eldest son. The parting between father and son was conducted with the stoic dignity the Mongols demanded of their men, but Temujin felt the weight of separation keenly. Yasuge's final words to his son were both blessing and warning. Remember that you are Borjigin. Remember that strength without wisdom is destruction, and wisdom without strength is weakness. Watch, listen, and learn. The steps will teach you what you need to know. Temujin settled into life among the Anjurat with the adaptability that marked his character throughout his life. He learned their customs, their songs, their way of training horses. He spent time with Börte, and their relationship began to develop beyond the formal requirements of betrothal. She possessed a quick intelligence that matched his own, and a strength of character that promised she would make a worthy partner in the challenges ahead. But the peace of this interlude was shattered by news that arrived like a thunderbolt from the clear sky. A messenger came riding hard from Borjigin lands, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with terrible tidings. Yasuge had been poisoned by Tatar tribesmen, traditional enemies of the Mongols who had harbored hatred for him since his victories over them in battle. The details of the poisoning followed the familiar pattern of steppe warfare. Yasuge had accepted hospitality from a group of Tatars while traveling, not recognizing them as enemies in the failing light of evening. They had shared food with him according to the sacred laws of hospitality, but they had tainted his portion with poison that worked slowly, allowing them to maintain the fiction of innocent hosts while ensuring his death. By the time Yasuge realized what had happened, it was too late. He had managed to reach home, but the poison was already completing its deadly work. With his dying breath, he had called for his eldest son, but Temujin was far away among the Anjurat, and there had been no time to summon him before the great chieftain's spirit departed for the eternal. Blue Sky Dot, the 10-year-old boy who had been promised to Börte, heard this news with a face that revealed nothing of the storm raging within. The Anjurat watched him carefully, wondering how he would respond to this tragedy that had instantly transformed his future. Would he collapse under the weight of loss and responsibility? Would he rage against the cruelty of fate? Would he appeal to them for continued shelter and protection? Instead, Temujin simply stood, thanked Sechin for his hospitality, and requested a horse for the journey home. There were no tears, no displays of emotion that might be interpreted as weakness. He said farewell to Börte with quiet dignity, promising that he would return for her when circumstances permitted. Then he rode out across the steppes toward a future that had suddenly become far more uncertain and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The journey home took him across terrain that now seemed different, touched by the shadow of loss. Every familiar landmark reminded him of conversations with his father, of lessons learned while riding together across this same ground. The boy who had left home to be betrothed was returning as the head of a clan, responsible for the welfare of people who had depended on his father's strength and wisdom. The reality that awaited Temujin among his own people was harsher than even he had imagined. In the few days since Yasuge's death, the Borgigin clan had begun to fragment like ice breaking up in spring thaw. Without the strong hand of their leader to hold them together, old rivalries and competing interests had quickly surfaced. Some of the minor chieftains had already departed with their followers, taking their herds and seeking alliance with more powerful neighbors. The situation was even more precarious than it appeared on the surface. Among the remaining Borgigin, there were those who questioned whether a mere boy could provide the leadership they needed. The steppes were unforgiving to the weak, and a clan without effective leadership would quickly find itself prey to stronger neighbors. Some spoke quietly of the need to find a new leader, perhaps from among Yasuge's brothers or trusted lieutenants. At the center of this uncertainty stood Temujin's mother, Holan, a woman whose strength had been largely hidden during her husband's lifetime, but now blazed forth like a beacon in the darkness. Faced with the disintegration of everything her family had built, she rose to the challenge with a fierce determination that awed even those who had known her for years. She understood that the survival of her children depended entirely on her ability to hold the remaining clan members together until Temujin could grow into his inheritance. Holan possessed qualities that were perhaps even more valuable than military prowess in these desperate circumstances. She had an intuitive understanding of human nature that allowed her to identify those who could be trusted and those who harbored secret ambitions. She knew how to appeal to honor and tradition when dealing with the older men, how to offer practical incentives to the younger ones, and how to use the bonds of kinship and obligation to maintain loyalty even in the face of hardship. But even her formidable abilities could not prevent the gradual erosion of the clan's strength. The most devastating blow came when Targutai, a minor chieftain who had served under Yasuge, openly declared that he could no longer follow a child leader. He gathered his supporters and departed, taking with him not only valuable fighting men but also much of the clan's remaining livestock and horses. This defection sent ripples of fear throughout the remaining Borgigin. If Targutai, who had been bound by oath to Yasuge, could break his loyalty so easily, what hope was there that others would remain faithful? The delicate web of relationships that held nomadic society together seemed to be unraveling, leaving Temujin's family increasingly isolated and vulnerable. The practical consequences of these departures were immediate and severe. The family found themselves with insufficient resources to maintain their traditional way of life. The great herds that had been the foundation of their wealth were reduced to a few horses and a small flock of sheep. Without enough followers to defend their grazing rights, they were forced to retreat to marginal lands where the grass was sparse and the water sources unreliable. It was during this period of desperate hardship that Temujin began to develop the qualities that would later make him one of history's greatest leaders. Faced with circumstances that might have crushed a lesser spirit, he responded with a combination of practical adaptability and iron determination. He learned to hunt and fish with the skill of a man twice his age, contributing vitally to the family's meager food supply. More importantly, he began to understand the deeper lessons that hardship teaches about human nature and leadership. He saw how quickly loyalty could dissolve when not backed by strength, how fear could drive even honorable men to dishonorable actions, how the bonds of kinship and tradition were fragile things that required constant reinforcement through deed, as well as word. The family's reduced circumstances also brought them into closer contact with the harsh realities of steppe life that wealth and power had previously insulated them from. They learned to make do with less, to find opportunity in situations that others might see as hopeless, to survive on resources that would have seemed impossibly meager in their former life. These lessons in resourcefulness and persistence would prove invaluable in the years to come. Yet even as Temujin adapted to these new realities, he never lost sight of his ultimate goal, the restoration of his family's honor and the reclamation of their rightful place among the Mongol tribes. He studied the movements of other clans, learning their strengths and weaknesses, identifying potential allies and enemies. He began to formulate ideas about how leadership should work, how loyalty should be rewarded, how strength should be built and maintained. The boy was becoming a student of power in its most fundamental forms. He observed how the successful khans of neighboring tribes maintained their authority, noting which strategies worked and which failed. He began to understand that true leadership required more than just personal charisma or military skill. It demanded a deep understanding of what motivated men, what they feared, what they desired, and how these forces could be channeled toward common purpose. During the long winter months, when travel was difficult and the family was forced to remain in their poor camp, Temujin spent hours listening to the stories and wisdom of the few loyal retainers who had remained with them. These men, though reduced in circumstances, possessed decades of experience in warfare, diplomacy, and the intricate politics of tribal life. From them, he learned the histories of great khans, the tactics that had won famous battles, the mistakes that had brought down mighty leaders. One story that particularly captured his imagination was that of Kobyl Khan, his great-great-grandfather, who had united many of the Mongol tribes under his leadership generations earlier. Kobyl had risen from relatively humble circumstances to become a figure of legendary power, commanding the respect and fear of enemies across the steppes. The parallel to his own situation was not lost on young Temujin, and he began to dream of following in his ancestors' footsteps. As winter gave way to spring, Temujin made a decision that would prove to be one of the most important of his life. Rather than continue to accept the family's reduced circumstances as permanent, he resolved to begin the long process of rebuilding their power and influence. He understood that this would require not just personal growth and skill development, but also the ability to attract and retain followers who would be willing to risk their lives and fortunes on the prospects of a young and unproven leader. The first test of Temujin's emerging leadership came not from external enemies, but from within his own family. His half-brother, Börte, son of one of Yasuge's other wives, had grown increasingly challenging as the family's circumstances deteriorated. The young man seemed to believe that with Yasuge dead and Temujin still essentially a child, he should assume leadership of what remained of the clan. The tension between the brothers had been building for months, manifested in small conflicts over food distribution, decision-making, and the treatment of the few remaining servants. Börte had begun to act as if he were the head of the family, making pronouncements about where they should camp, how resources should be allocated, and what their long-term strategy should be. This challenge to Temujin's authority could not be allowed to continue if he hoped to maintain any semblance of leadership. The breaking point came over a seemingly trivial matter, a fish that Temujin and his full brother Khwarezmian had caught in a nearby stream. Börte claimed the fish as his right, arguing that as the eldest son present, he should receive the choice portions of any food brought to the family. The dispute escalated quickly, with harsh words exchanged and old grievances brought to the surface. What happened next would haunt Temujin for the rest of his life, yet it also established him unquestionably as the leader of his family, unable to tolerate this continued challenge to his authority, and understanding that compromise would be interpreted as weakness. Temujin made a decision that demonstrated the ruthless pragmatism that would characterize his entire career. Together with Khwarezmian, he killed Börte, eliminating the threat to his leadership in the most final way possible. The murder of a half-brother was a grievous crime by Mongol standards, one that violated the most fundamental bonds of kinship and family loyalty. When Holan learned what her sons had done, her reaction was swift and terrible. She confronted them with words that cut deeper than any blade, accusing them of becoming no better than wild animals, of destroying the very foundation of family, unity that she had fought so hard to preserve. Yet even as she condemned their actions, Holan understood the pragmatic reality of what had occurred. The challenge to Temujin's authority had been real and growing, and in the harsh world of the steppes, decisive action was often the difference between survival and destruction. The killing of Börte, however morally questionable, had resolved the leadership crisis within the family and established, beyond doubt, that Temujin possessed the will to do whatever was necessary to maintain his position. The psychological impact of this event on Temujin himself was profound and lasting. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, demonstrated a capacity for violence that would become legendary, and learned that leadership sometimes required choices that haunted the conscience even as they served practical necessity. The weight of this knowledge settled upon him like armor, protective but burdensome, necessary but never comfortable. In the months that followed, the family's situation continued to deteriorate. Their enemies, sensing weakness, began to move against them more boldly. The most serious threat came from the Teyashard tribe, traditional rivals of the Borjigin, who saw an opportunity to eliminate a potential future challenger while he was still vulnerable. They launched a raid designed not just to capture livestock or territory, but to capture Temujin himself. The attack came at dawn, when the morning mist still clung to the grass and visibility was limited. The Teeshard warriors swept down on the family's camp with overwhelming force, scattering the few defenders and seizing everything of value. Temujin, still a teenager but already marked as a future threat, was taken prisoner and carried back to the Teeshard camp as a prize of war. Captivity among the Teeshard was both humiliating and educational. For the young man who would one day conquer nations, he was forced to wear a wooden collar called a kang, a device designed to prevent escape and mark him as a prisoner. During the day, he was put to work performing menial tasks under the watchful eyes of guards. At night, he was confined under heavy security, his captors well aware that even a teenage prisoner could be dangerous if given the slightest opportunity. Yet this period of captivity, as degrading as it was, provided Temujin with invaluable insights into the organization and psychology of his enemies. He observed how the Teeshard structured their society, how they made decisions, where their strengths and weaknesses lay. He noted which guards were alert and which were complacent, which leaders commanded genuine respect and which relied on fear or tradition to maintain their authority. More importantly, he began to identify potential allies even among his captors. Not all of the Teeshard were enthusiastic about holding a young prisoner indefinitely, particularly one whose only crime was being born into a rival clan. Some of the younger warriors, particularly those who had known and respected Yesu, began to show signs of sympathy for his son's plight. The opportunity for escape came during a tribal celebration when the usual security measures were relaxed and many of the guards had been drinking. Temujin managed to slip away from his captors under cover of darkness, still wearing the cumbersome wooden collar, but determined to reach freedom or die in the attempt. The escape itself became the stuff of legend, with later accounts crediting divine intervention, the assistance of sympathetic guards, and Temujin's own superhuman determination. The reality was probably more prosaic, but no less impressive. A young man who had been carefully studying his surroundings for months finally found the combination of opportunity and courage necessary to attempt what seemed impossible. The escape required not just physical courage, but also the mental discipline to wait for the right moment and the practical intelligence to navigate safely across hostile territory. While burdened by the wooden collar, his return to his family was greeted with joy tempered by the sobering realization that their situation remained precarious. The Teeshard would certainly attempt to recapture him, and other enemies would be emboldened by the successful raid against their camp. It was clear that survival would require more than just defensive measures. They needed to begin building alliances and gathering strength for the long struggle ahead. The young man who emerged from this ordeal was noticeably changed from the boy who had been captured months earlier. The experience of captivity had hardened him physically and mentally, while also teaching him valuable lessons about the importance of intelligence gathering, the psychology of power, and the potential for finding allies in unexpected places. He had also learned that survival sometimes required taking enormous risks, and that fortune favored those who combined careful preparation with decisive action as Temujin began to plan for the future. He understood that his family's period of defensive survival was coming to an end. They could not remain weak and isolated indefinitely while surrounded by enemies who grew stronger and bolder with each passing season. The time had come to begin the long process of building the power base that would eventually transform him from a fugitive teenager into the master of the largest contiguous empire in human history. The first step in this transformation would be to reconnect with old allies and forge new alliances that could provide the foundation for future growth. Among the names at the top of his list was Jamuka, a childhood friend whose family had maintained friendly relations with the Borgigin during Yasuge's lifetime. The reunion with Jamuka would prove to be both a crucial stepping stone in Temujin's rise and the beginning of a rivalry that would shape the destiny of the Mongol tribes for decades to come. The alliance with Jamuka had been like walking on ice beneath a winter sun, beautiful on the surface, treacherous underneath. By the time Temujin reached his 20th year, the cracks in their brotherhood had become chasms that no amount of shared memory could bridge. The steppes, vast and seemingly endless, were not large enough to contain two such ambitious souls. The break came not with thunder, but with whispers. Jamuka's followers began to murmur of his harshness, his willingness to boil captured enemies alive in great iron cauldrons, his treatment of those who showed him less than absolute loyalty. Word spread across the grasslands like wildfire. In drought season, Temujin's camp welcomed the dispossessed, the forgotten, the cast aside. Where Jamuka demanded submission, Temujin offered brotherhood. The first great test of this philosophy came when Jamuka's own brother, seeking escape from his cruelty, rode through the night to Temujin's camp. The stars wheeled overhead as the refugee knelt before the young Khan, offering his sword and his service. Temujin accepted both, but more importantly, he shared his fire and his food. By dawn, 17 more warriors had followed the same path. The politics of the steppes were as complex as the patterns woven by spider silk caught in morning dew. Every tribe had grievances stretching back generations. Every alliance carried the weight of ancient betrayals. The Tatars, who had poisoned father, controlled the eastern grasslands with iron discipline. The Merkits still nursed their wounded pride from the rescue of Börte, while the Naimans to the west watched all with calculating eyes, their Khan Taiyang growing fat on the tribute of lesser tribes. Into this web of resentment and ambition, Temujin began to weave his own design. He understood something that his rivals did not. The steppes were changing. The old ways, where might alone determined right, were giving way to something new. Trade routes were shifting, bringing wealth from distant lands. The Chinese kingdoms to the south were fragmenting, offering opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. But to take advantage of these changes, the Mongols needed unity. The message came on an autumn morning, when the grass had turned gold and the wind carried the promise of winter. Ong Khan of the Keraites, that weathered old fox who had once been Yasuge's sworn brother, requested Temujin's presence at his court. The summons was wrapped in the language of courtesy, but Temujin could read the steel beneath the silk. Ong Khan needed allies, and perhaps, just perhaps, he was beginning to see in Yasuge's son something more than a minor tribal chief. The journey to the Keraite court took 3 days across terrain that seemed to breathe with the spirits of the ancestors. Rolling hills gave way to river valleys, where ancient burial mounds dotted the landscape like sleeping giants. Temujin rode with 50 of his best warriors, their horses moving in perfect formation, their silence speaking louder than any boast. Behind them, hidden in the morning mist, followed another 100 riders, close enough to respond to trouble, distant enough to avoid giving offense. Ongkon's court was unlike anything in the Mongol camps. The Keraites had adopted Christianity from Nestorian missionaries, and their great ger was decorated with crosses and icons alongside the traditional spirit banners. The old Khan himself was a study in contradictions, Christian prayers on his lips, shamanic amulets at his throat, the mannerisms of a civilized prince masking the instincts of a steppe predator. "Young wolf," Ongkan said as Temujin approached his throne, using the traditional greeting but with an undertone that suggested both respect and warning. "You have grown into your father's strength, but I wonder, have you inherited his wisdom as well?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the ceremonial fire. Around them, Keraite nobles watched with calculating eyes, measuring this young Mongol chief against their expectations. Some saw only another ambitious tribal leader, destined to burn bright and brief like a meteor across the night sky. Others, perhaps more perceptive, sensed something differenter, quality of stillness that spoke of deeper currents running far below the surface. Temujin's response revealed the diplomat he was becoming. "Great Khan," he said, his voice carrying just the right mixture of deference and confidence. "My father taught me that true strength comes not from the sword alone, but from knowing when to draw it and when to keep it sheathed. I have come not to boast of conquests, but to speak of the future we might build together." The negotiations that followed lasted 3 days and revealed the complexities of steppe politics in all their intricate detail. Ongkon was caught between multiple pressures. The Naimans were growing too powerful in the west. The Tatars had formed new alliances that threatened Keraite trade routes, and his own son, Sengam, chafed at his father's cautious policies, eager for military glory that would establish his own reputation. What emerged from these discussions was not a formal alliance, but something more subtle and potentially more valuable: mutual recognition. Ongkan acknowledged Temujin as a legitimate ruler of the Mongols, no longer merely a refugee or upstart pretender. In return, Temujin accepted Ongkon's overlordship in matters of broader steppe politics, a symbolic submission that cost him nothing while gaining him the protection of Keraite strength. The first real test of this new arrangement came sooner than anyone expected. Jamukha, feeling the pressure of desertions from his own camp, decided to force the issue with a direct assault on Temujin's growing power. He had gathered a confederation of tribal leaders who saw in Temujin's rise a threat to their own ambitions, the old guard who preferred the traditional chaos of intertribal warfare to any possibility of unified Mongol leadership. The battle of Dalan Baljut, fought on a plain where generations of their ancestors had grazed their herds in peace, became the crucible in which Temujin's military genius first revealed itself. Jamukha commanded the larger force, perhaps 13,000, warriors drawn from a dozen tribes. But Temujin had something his blood brother lacked: absolute. loyalty from men who had chosen to follow him rather than being compelled by tribal obligation. The night before battle, Temujin walked among his warriors as they prepared their weapons, and whispered prayers to the eternal blue sky. Unlike the boastful speeches common among steppe commanders, he spoke quietly to small groups, asking about their families, remembering details of their service, sharing his own concerns about the coming fight. By dawn, his army felt less like a collection of tribal warriors and more like an extended family preparing to defend their home. The battle itself unfolded with a precision that surprised even Temujin's own generals, where Jamukha relied on the traditional steppe tactic of massed cavalry charges. Temujin introduced innovations that would later become hallmarks of Mongol warfare. His forces were organized into decimal unit stens, hundreds, thousands, with clear chains of command. That allowed for rapid redeployment during combat. When Jamukha's center charged, expecting to break Temujin's line through sheer force, they found themselves striking not a solid wall, but a formation that bent without breaking, channeling their attack into killing zones where Temujin's archers could devastate their ranks. The turning point came when Jamukha himself, leading his personal guard in a desperate attempt to reach Temujin, found his path blocked by a wall of Mongol shields. The two blood brothers faced each other across 20 yards of churned earth and scattered arrows, their eyes meeting for what would be the last time as allies turned enemies. In that moment, both understood that their childhood friendship had died somewhere in the ambitions of adulthood, leaving only the bitter taste of what might have been. Jamukha's retreat was not the route. It might have been under other circumstances. His personal courage, whatever his other faults, had never been in question, and he managed to extract the majority of his forces in good order. But the psychological impact of defeat was devastating. Word spread across the steppes that Temujin was not merely lucky or favored by fortune. He was genuinely superior as a military commander, blessed with the kind of tactical insight that marked true greatness. More importantly, the aftermath of Dalan Baljut revealed Temujin's emerging philosophy of governance. Where other steppe conquerors might have executed prisoners or demanded crushing tribute from defeated enemies, Temujin offered integration. Warriors who had fought against him were welcomed into his forces if they swore genuine loyalty. Tribal leaders who submitted were confirmed in their positions, their authority strengthened rather than diminished by association with his growing power. This magnanimity was not weakness, but calculated wisdom. The steppes had been weakened for generations by constant internal warfare, with talent wasted in fratricidal conflicts that served no one's interests. Temujin was beginning to envision something unprecedented in Mongol history, a united people capable of projecting their power far beyond the traditional borders of the grasslands. The seasons turned, and with them came the gradual transformation of Temujin's confederation from a collection of allied tribes into something approaching a true nation. The changes were subtle at first: common standards for weights and measures, shared protocols for the treatment of prisoners, the beginning of a unified legal code that transcended traditional tribal boundaries. But their cumulative effect was revolutionary. The Yasa, as Temujin's emerging law code came to be known, reflected his understanding that lasting power required more than military conquest, demanded the creation of systems that could outlast any individual ruler. Theft was punishable by death, ensuring that trade could flourish under Mongol protection. Religious tolerance was not just permitted, but mandated, recognizing that the diverse peoples of the steppes brought with them valuable skills and knowledge that should be preserved rather than suppressed. Perhaps most importantly, the Yasa established the principle of meritocracy over blood nobility. Traditional tribal hierarchies, where position was determined by birth rather than ability, began to give way to a system where talent and loyalty were the primary qualifications for advancement. This was revolutionary thinking in a world where aristocratic privilege had been the foundation of political power for centuries. The implementation of these reforms was not without resistance. Established tribal elders, accustomed to hereditary authority, grumbled about upstart commoners being elevated to positions of influence. But Temujin's response was characteristically practical. He demonstrated that armies led by competent generals defeated armies led by noble incompetence, and the evidence was written in victory after victory across the contested grasslands. During this period of consolidation, Temujin also began to attract followers from beyond the traditional Mongol tribes. Chinese administrators, fleeing the chaos of collapsing dynasties, brought with them knowledge of advanced governance and military technology. Khitan and Jurchen warriors, displaced by political upheavals in their homelands, found welcome in an army that valued skill over ethnicity. Persian merchants, recognizing the commercial opportunities in a unified steppe, established trading posts in Mongol territory and shared their expertise in finance and logistics. This cultural synthesis created something unprecedented in the history of the steppes, a cosmopolitan nomadic society that combined the traditional strengths of pastoral mobility with the organizational capabilities of settled civilizations. Temujin's court became a place where shamans consulted with Christian priests, where Chinese scholars debated military strategy with Mongol generals, where the ancient oral traditions of the grasslands were being preserved in written form for the first time. The military implications of this cultural mixing were profound. Traditional Mongol strengths, superb horsemanship, tactical mobility, psychological warfare were enhanced by borrowed innovations from more settled societies. Chinese siege techniques, Persian intelligence networks, Khitan administrative systems, all were adapted to serve the needs of a rapidly expanding nomadic empire. But perhaps the most significant development during this period was the evolution of Temujin himself. The desperate young man who had once hidden in the wilderness, dependent on the kindness of others for survival, was transforming into a leader of genuine vision. His childhood experiences of poverty and exile had taught him empathy for the dispossessed, while his years of struggle had forged an iron determination to create a world where such suffering was unnecessary. The betrayal, when it came, arrived dressed in the garb of diplomacy. Ongkon's son Sengam had finally convinced his aging father that Temujin's growing power posed an existential threat to Karaite independence. What had begun as a mutually beneficial alliance was transforming into a relationship where the junior partner was rapidly becoming the dominant force, and such transformations rarely ended peacefully in the violent world of steppe politics. The trap was elegantly conceived. Sengam proposed a marriage alliance between his sister and Temujin's eldest son, Joki, with the wedding feast to be held at the traditional gathering place of the Keraite elite. The invitation was accompanied by all the proper ceremonial gifts. The protocols observed with meticulous care. To refuse would have been an insult that justified military action. To accept meant walking into what Temujin's instincts warned him was almost certainly an ambush. The warning came from an unexpected source, Bodai and Kishlik, to Keraite nobles who had grown to respect Temujin during the years of alliance, rode through the night to reach his camp before dawn. Their message was terse but devastating. Khan planned to eliminate Temujin and his core leadership during the wedding celebrations, then absorb the leaderless Mongol tribes into his own confederation. Temujin's response revealed both his military acumen and his psychological insight into human nature. Rather than confronting the Keraites directly or retreating to a defensive position, he chose a third option that his enemies had not anticipated. He divided his forces, sending the majority of his people and herds north to safety, while keeping only his most elite warriors for what would prove to be one of the most audacious operations in steppe military history. The night's attack on the Keraite camp was planned with the precision of a master chess player contemplating his final moves. Temujin's intelligence network, cultivated over years of alliance, provided detailed information about Keraite defensive arrangements, guard rotations, even the sleeping habits of key leaders. The assault began at the darkest hour before dawn, when human alertness naturally reaches its lowest ebb. What followed was not a traditional battle, but something closer to a surgical strike. Small units of Mongol warriors, moving with the silence of hunting wolves, penetrated the Keraite perimeter at multiple points simultaneously. Their targets were not the common soldiers, but the command-structured tent ropes cut in the darkness. Key leaders eliminated before they could organize resistance. Communications disrupted to prevent coordinated response. Khan himself, awakened by the sounds of combat, found his tent surrounded by Mongol warriors who had appeared as if materialized from the night itself. The old fox's final act was perhaps his finest, rather than begging for mercy or raging against his fate. He looked Temujin in the eye and nodded once, a gesture that acknowledged both defeat and a grudging respect for the younger man's tactical superiority. The integration of the Keraite forces into Temujin's confederation followed the same pattern established after previous victories, but on a much larger scale. The Keraites had been one of the most powerful and sophisticated groups on the steppes, their defeat sending shockwaves throughout the nomadic world. Suddenly, Temujin controlled not just the loyalty of his original Mongol followers, but commanded the allegiance of perhaps the most militarily advanced tribal confederation in the region. More importantly, the Keraite victory provided Temujin with resources that transformed the strategic balance of power across the entire steppe region. Keraite wealth, accumulated through generations of successful raiding and trade, funded the expansion of Mongol military capabilities. Keraite diplomatic networks provided intelligence about potential enemies and opportunities for alliance. Keraite administrative systems offered models for governing an increasingly complex, multi-tribal confederation. The destruction of the Keraites left only one power capable of challenging Mongol hegemony over the eastern steppes, Tayan Khan of. The Naimans had watched Temujin's rise with growing alarm, understanding better than most that the traditional balance of power was shifting in ways that threatened all established hierarchies. Unlike Jamukha's emotional hatred or Khan's calculated betrayal, Tiong's opposition to Temujin was based on cold, strategic logic. There was simply no room in the steppes for two supreme powers. The Naimans represented a different model of steppe civilization from the Mongols, more settled, more hierarchical, more influenced by the sophisticated cultures of Central Asia. They had developed military and administrative systems that in many ways surpassed those of their eastern neighbors. Tayan Khan commanded not just tribal warriors but professional soldiers, Not just traditional shamans, but educated administrators. Not just the loyalty of blood relations, but the calculated support of established political class. The diplomatic prelude to war revealed the growing sophistication of Temujin's political thinking. Rather than simply massing his forces for a direct assault, he began a careful campaign to isolate the Naimans from potential allies. Messages were sent to tribal leaders throughout the region, pointing out that Naiman victory would mean the establishment of a rigid hierarchy that would leave no room for the independence that smaller tribes had traditionally enjoyed. Better to support Mongol unity, which promised to preserve tribal autonomy within a larger confederation, than Naiman domination, which would reduce all others to tributary status. This diplomatic campaign was remarkably successful. One by one, tribes that might have supported the Naimans chose neutrality, or even provided covert assistance to the Mongols. The Tatars, ancient enemies of Temujin's people, nevertheless recognized that Naiman hegemony would be far worse for their interests than Mongol confederation. Even some Naiman sub-tribes began to question whether their loyalty to Tayan Khan was worth the risks of what promised to be a devastating war. The final confrontation came at Shakarmort, a valley whose name would be remembered long after the bones of the fallen had turned to dust. Tayan Khan, despite his political isolation, had assembled an impressive force, 15,000 warriors, well-equipped and disciplined, supported by Chinese siege engineers and led by generals with genuine tactical expertise. In purely numerical terms, the forces were roughly equal, but the character of the two armies could not have been more different. Taiyang's forces were organized along traditional lines, with noble-born officers commanding troops drawn from their own tribal territories. This system had the advantage of clear hierarchical authority, but the disadvantage of limited flexibility when battlefield conditions required rapid adaptation. Temujin's army, by contrast, was organized according to his decimal system, with promotion based on merit rather than birth, and tactical doctrines emphasizing speed and adaptability over rigid adherence to predetermined plans. The battle itself became a masterclass in the evolution of steppe warfare, where traditional nomadic combat had emphasized individual heroism and massed charges. Temujin introduced coordinated unit tactics that maximized the effectiveness of combined arms operations. His light cavalry harassed enemy formations, while his heavy cavalry waited for the optimal moment to strike. His archers, positioned on carefully chosen ground, created killing zones that channeled enemy movement into predetermined patterns. But, perhaps most importantly, Temujin demonstrated an understanding of psychological warfare that went far beyond the usual pre-battle boasting and intimidation. Throughout the engagement, he made sure that news of Naiman casualties and tactical failures spread rapidly through enemy ranks, while simultaneously highlighting opportunities for surrender that would be honored with dignity rather than punished with death. The result was an enemy army that began to disintegrate from within, even as it fought with desperate courage on the battlefield. Taiyang Khan's death marked the end of an era in steppe history. With his passing, the last major power capable of challenging Mongol supremacy was broken, leaving Temujin as the unquestioned master of the eastern grasslands. But the victory at Shakarmort was significant for reasons that went beyond mere military conquest. It demonstrated that the Mongol system of organization and warfare was superior not just to traditional tribal methods, but to the more sophisticated approaches attempted by their settled neighbors. The aftermath of the Naiman campaign revealed the maturation of Temujin's vision for Mongol society. Rather than simply looting the defeated enemy, his forces systematically incorporated Naiman innovations into their own systems. Naiman scribes were employed to improve Mongol record-keeping. Naiman craftsmen were encouraged to teach their skills to Mongol apprentices. Even Naiman military techniques were studied and adapted where they offered improvements over existing Mongol practices. This pattern of selective cultural adoption would become one of the defining characteristics of the Mongol Empire at its height. A willingness to learn from conquered peoples, while maintaining the core values and capabilities that had made conquest possible in the first place. It was a sophisticated approach to imperial administration that recognized strength as coming not from cultural purity, but from the intelligent synthesis of the best elements from multiple traditions, that as the seasons turned and news of the Naiman victory spread throughout the known world, Temujin found himself in a position that no Mongol leader had ever occupied before. He commanded the loyalty of virtually all the nomadic peoples of the eastern steppes, controlled trade routes that connected China with Central Asia, and possessed military capabilities that had been proven against every major rival. The foundation of an empire had been laid, though the structure that would rise upon it was still hidden in the mists of an uncertain future. In the quiet moments between campaigns, as he sat beside his fire and watched the stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance, Temujin must have reflected on the journey that had brought him from a desperate refugee hiding in the wilderness to the master of the steppes. The boy who had once survived on roots and small game had become a man capable of commanding armies and shaping the destinies of nations. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his transformation was not what he had gained, but what he had managed to preserve, the memory of hunger that made him merciful to the defeated, the experience of exile that made him welcoming to the dispossessed, the knowledge of what it meant to be powerless that informed his use of power. The unification of the Mongol tribes was complete, but Temujin's story was far from over. Beyond the familiar horizons of the steppes lay worlds yet unconquered, civilizations yet to be encountered, challenges that would test not just his military genius, but his capacity to transform a confederation of nomadic tribes into an empire that would span continents. The first act of his epic had ended with triumph, but the greatest scenes still lay ahead, waiting to be written in the annals of history by the actions of the man who would soon be known to the world as Genghis Khan. The morning sun cast long shadows across the assembled might of the Mongol nation. What had begun as scattered tribes now stood as one unified force, their horses stamping impatiently as steam rose from their nostrils in the crisp dawn air. Temujin, now proclaimed as Genghis Khan, sat motionless atop his warhorse, his eyes surveying the vast sea of warriors that stretched beyond the horizon. The steppe had given birth to something unprecedented, an army that moved like a living thing, breathing in unison, pulsing with a single heartbeat. The transformation was more than military. It was alchemical. Where once Mongol warriors had fought as individual heroes, seeking personal glory, they now moved as organs of a greater body. Genghis Khan had divided his forces into units of 10, then hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s, called Tamen. Each unit functioned with precision, yet retained the fluid adaptability that was the Mongol birthright. When the Khan raised his standard, a forest of similar banners responded across the plain, each commander ready to execute movements that had been practiced until they became instinct. The first test of this new military machine came not from enemies, but from the steppe itself. Genghis Khan understood that before his warriors could conquer the world, they must first conquer distance. The Mongol army became a master of logistics, each warrior accompanied not by one horse, but by 3 or 4. When one mount tired, the Rider would leap to a fresh horse without breaking stride. Supply trains moved with the fluidity of rivers, carrying not massive baggage, but essential tools for survival and war. Soldiers learned to subsist on mare's milk and dried meat, to sleep in the saddle, to navigate by stars that had guided there. Ancestors across the endless grasslands, intelligence flowed through this army like blood through veins. Scouts rode hundreds of miles ahead of the main force, their eyes trained to read the landscape like scripture. They noted the positions of rivers, the quality of pasture, the locations of cities, and most importantly, the movements of enemy forces. This information traveled back through a network of messengers who could cover vast distances with supernatural speed. By the time enemies learned that the Mongols were approaching, the storm was already upon them. The Khan's strategic genius lay not merely in the speed of his forces, but in their ability to appear where they were impossible, to strike where defenses were weakest, and to vanish before retaliation could be organized. Cities that expected siege warfare found themselves facing raids that melted away like a morning mist. Armies that marched to engage the Mongols discovered they were pursuing shadows, only to find the real threat had circled behind them to devastate their homeland. Beyond the immediate borders of Mongolia lay the Western Shire Kingdom, a realm that controlled crucial segments of the Silk Road trade routes. These were not merely commercial pathways, but arteries through which flowed the lifeblood of international commerce: silk, spices, precious metals, and ideas that connected East and West. The rulers of Western Shire had grown wealthy by taxing this trade, their cities adorned with treasures from distant lands, their armies equipped with the finest weapons that money could purchase. Genghis Khan's eyes fell upon these cities with the calculating gaze of a predator. The Western Shi'ar campaign would serve multiple purposes. It would test his reformed army against settled civilizations, secure vital trade routes for Mongol control, and send a message to other powers about the reach of Mongol ambition. The attack, when it came, followed the pattern that would become the Khan's signature: swift, overwhelming, and utterly unexpected. The siege of the Western Shia capital demonstrated the Mongols' rapid adaptation to warfare against fortified cities. Where once they had been purely nomadic raiders, they quickly learned to employ siege engines, to redirect rivers, to starve cities into submission. But their greatest weapon remained psychological warfare. Stories spread ahead of their advance of cities that surrendered being spared, while those that resisted faced complete destruction. The choice was stark and simple: submit or perish. What made the Mongol approach revolutionary was their integration of diverse military traditions. Chinese engineers taught them to build trebuchets and siege towers. Persian architects showed them how to undermine walls. Muslim scholars shared knowledge of Greek fire and other incendiary weapons. The Mongol army became a synthesis of military knowledge from across the known world, each conquered people contributing their expertise to an ever-growing arsenal of techniques. The fall of Western Shire's cities came not through prolonged siege, but through the methodical application of terror and mercy in calculated doses. Cities that surrendered immediately found their trade protected and their populations largely unmolested. Those that resisted faced systematic destruction, but even then, craftsmen and scholars were spared. their skills deemed too valuable to waste. This pragmatic approach to conquest would become a hallmark of Mongol expansion, brutal, when necessary, but always purposeful. As Western Shire crumbled, the wealth of the Silk Road began flowing toward Karakoram. Gold, silver, and precious stones filled the Khan's treasury, but more valuable still were the artisans, administrators, and scholars who came with the conquered territories. The Mongol Empire was becoming something unprecedented, a nomadic power that could absorb and utilize the knowledge of settled civilizations without losing its essential mobility and adaptability. To the northeast of the Mongol homeland lay the Jin Dynasty, the Golden Kingdom that ruled northern China with an authority that seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves. For centuries, the Jin had viewed the nomadic tribes of the steppe as useful barbarians, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, but always subservient to the superior civilization that governed from behind massive walls and well-ordered cities. The Jin court could not conceive that these horse-riding nomads might pose an existential threat to their ancient empire. The Jin military philosophy rested on static defense and overwhelming numbers. Their armies were vast, well-equipped, and supported by the most advanced military technology of the age. Gunpowder weapons, sophisticated siege engines, and elaborate fortifications protected a realm that had endured for generations. The Jin generals, educated in the classical military texts, prepared for warfare as their ancestors had fought it, massive armies clashing in predetermined battlefields, with victory going to whoever could maintain the longest line of supply and the largest reserves of men. Genghis Khan studied this mighty empire with the patience of a hunter observing his prey. He noted the locations of the great cities, the patterns of Jin military deployment, the seasonal rhythms of agriculture that fed the empire's vast population. Most importantly, he identified the fundamental weakness that would prove fatal: the Jin assumption that warfare was predictable, that enemies would behave according to established patterns, that superior numbers and technology would inevitably triumph over mobility and imagination. The Mongol invasion of Jin territory began not with a great battle, but with 1,000 small ones. Raiding parties struck supply convoys, isolated garrisons, and administrative centers. Each attack lasted only hours, but the cumulative effect was devastating. The Jin military found itself responding to threats that materialized and vanished with bewildering speed. Resources were diverted from frontline defense to protect the rear areas, creating vulnerabilities that the Mongols immediately exploited. The psychological impact of these raids extended far beyond their material damage. The Jin people had lived for generations secure in the belief that their empire was invulnerable, protected by distance, walls, and the inherent superiority of civilized warfare over barbarian tactics. As reports of Mongol successes spread, this confidence began to crumble. Merchants hesitated to travel traditional routes. Farmers abandoned fields that lay too close to raiding paths. The very foundations of Jin's economic life began to shift. As the population struggled to adapt to a new reality where safety could no longer be assumed, Genghis Khan's tactical genius revealed itself most clearly in his approach to Jin strongholds. Rather than assault these fortifications directly, he isolated them through systematic destruction of their supply networks. Cities that had been centers of administration and trade found themselves cut off from the agricultural regions that fed them and the commercial routes that sustained their economies. Garrisons that had seemed impregnable discovered that walls were useless when there was nothing left inside them worth defending. The siege of Zhongdu, the Jin capital, became a masterpiece of psychological and logistical warfare. The Mongols surrounded the city not with a continuous line of investment, but with a network of mobile forces that interdicted all supplies while maintaining complete freedom of movement for themselves. The defenders, accustomed to siege warfare where attackers were as trapped as the besieged, found themselves fighting an enemy that could withdraw at will, replenish supplies from the surrounding countryside, and return refreshed while the city slowly starved. Victory in battle was only the beginning of Genghis Khan's revolutionary approach to empire building, where other conquerors had simply imposed tribute systems on defeated peoples. The Khan began to construct something far more sophisticated, true administrative state that could govern vast territories populated by diverse peoples with different languages, customs, and beliefs. This transformation from tribal leader to imperial administrator required skills that seemed to contradict everything the nomadic lifestyle had traditionally represented. The foundation of Mongol administration was the yam, a postal relay system that connected the furthest reaches of the empire with communication lines of unprecedented speed and reliability. Riders stationed at regular intervals could carry messages across thousands of miles in a fraction of the time required by traditional methods. This network served not merely for official correspondence, but as the nervous system of imperial governance. Tax records, legal decisions, military orders, and commercial information flowed along these routes, binding the empire together with threads of information. Genghis Khan's approach to governance was pragmatic rather than ideological. He retained local administrative structures wherever they proved effective, incorporating talented officials regardless of their ethnic or religious background. Chinese bureaucrats found themselves working alongside Persian mathematicians, Arab merchants, and European craftsmen. The Khan's court became a cosmopolitan center where knowledge and techniques from across the known world were synthesized into new forms of administrative efficiency. Religious tolerance was not merely a policy, but a strategic necessity for governing such diverse populations. The Khan himself practiced the traditional shamanism of the steppes, but he granted equal protection to Buddhist monasteries, Christian churches, Islamic mosques, and Confucian academies. This tolerance was calculated rather than philosophical religious institutions were valuable. Sources of educated administrators and religious conflicts could destabilize entire regions. By protecting all faiths equally, the Khan prevented religious differences from becoming sources of rebellion while gaining access to the intellectual resources of each tradition. The Mongol legal system, the Yasa, represented an attempt to create universal standards of justice that could govern nomadic warriors and settled farmers alike. While harsh in its punishments, the code was remarkably egalitarian in its application. Noble and commoner faced the same penalties for the same crimes. Military discipline was absolute, but it applied equally to generals and foot soldiers. This legal framework provided stability in regions where traditional authority structures had been disrupted by conquest. Economic integration followed political unification with remarkable speed. The Mongols established standardized weights and measures across their territories, facilitating trade between regions that had previously used incompatible commercial systems. Silver became the standard medium of exchange, replacing the bewildering variety of local currencies that had complicated interregional commerce. Safe passage was guaranteed to merchants who paid Mongol taxes, and the notorious banditry that had plagued trade routes was eliminated through ruthless enforcement. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongol Empire became a conduit for technological and intellectual exchange on an unprecedented scale. Printing technology spread from China to Central Asia. Islamic mathematics and astronomy reached Chinese scholars. European metallurgy was adopted by craftsmen thousands of miles from its origin. The empire became a vast laboratory where innovations could be tested, refined, and disseminated across cultural boundaries that had previously seemed insurmountable. As the Jin Dynasty crumbled under relentless Mongol pressure, Genghis Khan's attention turned toward horizons that seemed to stretch beyond the edge of the known world. Merchants and refugees from the fallen kingdoms brought tales of lands that lay far to the west, the Khwarezmian Empire, which controlled the ancient cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, and beyond that, whispered stories of kingdoms whose very names seemed like legends. The Khan's imagination was captured not merely by the prospect of additional conquests, but by the vision of an empire that might encompass the entire world. The Khwarezmian Empire represented everything that Genghis Khan had learned to defeat. It was wealthy, sophisticated, and supremely confident in its military superiority. The Khwarezmshays ruled from magnificent cities adorned with the finest architecture Islamic civilization could produce. Their armies were professional, well-equipped, and supported by the most advanced military engineering of their time. Most crucially, they controlled the western segments of the Silk Road, commanding wealth that flowed from Europe to Asia and back again. Initial contact between the Mongol and Khwarezmian empires followed, diplomatic protocols that both sides understood. Genghis Khan sent trade missions westward, testing both the commercial possibilities and the political responses of these distant rulers. The Mongol approach was characteristically pragmatic. If trade could be established peacefully, there would be no need for conquest. The wealth of nations could flow toward Mongolia through commerce rather than warfare, enriching both sides while avoiding the costs and uncertainties of military campaigns. The transformation of diplomacy into warfare came through a sequence of miscalculations that neither side fully intended but both found impossible to prevent. A Mongol trade caravan was attacked and destroyed at the border city of Otra, its merchants killed and their goods confiscated. The governor of Otra, Inulhuk, claimed the merchants were spies rather than traders, justifying the massacre as defensive action. When Genghis Khan demanded justice for this attack, the Khwarezm Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, not only refused but executed the Mongol ambassadors sent to negotiate a peaceful resolution. The execution of ambassadors violated one of the most fundamental principles of Mongol law and custom. Envoys were sacred figures whose safety was guaranteed by all civilized nations. Their murder was not merely an insult, but a declaration that the Khwarezmian Empire rejected the basic diplomatic frameworks that allowed different peoples to coexist peacefully. Genghis Khan's response was as inevitable as the sunrise. The full might of the Mongol Empire would be directed westward until justice was achieved and the insult avenged. The Mongol war machine that began moving toward Khwarezm in 1219 was far more sophisticated than the force that had conquered the Jin Dynasty. Years of campaigning had refined Mongol tactical doctrine, incorporating lessons learned from each victory and defeat. The army that crossed the steppes toward Central Asia included not only Mongol cavalry but also Chinese engineers, Persian administrators, and specialists in siege warfare drawn from across the conquered territories. This was no longer a tribal migration, but an imperial expedition designed to project Mongol power across continental distances. The strategic approach to the Khwarezmian campaign demonstrated the full maturation of Genghis Khan's military genius. Rather than advance along predictable routes toward obvious targets, the Mongol forces divided into multiple columns that struck simultaneously across hundreds of miles of frontier. The Khwarezmian military, expecting to face a single invasion force that could be concentrated against and defeated, instead found itself responding to attacks that seemed to materialize from empty desert. Cities fell in rapid succession, each victory providing intelligence and resources for the next phase of the campaign. The psychological dimension of this Western campaign revealed new depths of Mongol strategic thinking. Stories of Mongol victories spread faster than the armies themselves, creating panic that proved more effective than siege engines in reducing enemy resistance. Cities began surrendering before they were even attacked, their leaders calculating that submission offered better prospects than resistance. The Mongol reputation for both ruthless destruction and generous treatment of those who surrendered peacefully became a weapon more powerful than any material force. As the ancient cities of Central Asia opened their gates to Mongol armies, Genghis Khan found himself confronting challenges that extended far beyond military conquest. The urban civilizations of Khwarezm were more sophisticated than anything the Mongols had previously encountered. Libraries contained manuscripts in languages the Mongols could not read. Administrative systems operated according to principles they did not understand. The wealth that accumulated in these cities depended on commercial and manufacturing activities that were foreign to nomadic experience. The solution was characteristically pragmatic. Rather than attempt to impose Mongol administrative methods on urban populations, the Khan began incorporating local expertise into imperial governance. Persian administrators explained tax collection systems. Arab scholars translated important documents. Jewish merchants provided insight into international trade networks. The Mongol Empire was becoming something unprecedented, a synthesis of nomadic military power and urban administrative sophistication that combined the best aspects of both traditions while avoiding the limitations of either. The fall of Samarkand and Bukhara marked more than military victories. They represented the Mongol Empire's emergence as the dominant force in international politics. These cities had been centers of Islamic civilization for centuries, their schools and libraries among the most renowned institutions of learning in the world. Their capture sent shockwaves throughout the Islamic world and beyond, alerting distant kingdoms that a new power had emerged on the world stage. European courts began receiving reports of Eastern conquests that seemed too vast to be credible. The Mongol Empire was becoming a fact that the entire world would have to acknowledge and accommodate. Yet even as his armies achieved victory after victory in the West, Genghis Khan remained aware that conquest was only the beginning of empire building. The territories now under Mongol control contained millions of people with their own languages, customs, and expectations of governance. The Mongol administrative system would need to expand and adapt to meet these challenges. More importantly, the Khan himself would need to evolve from a tribal war leader into the head of a multicultural empire whose subjects included Chinese farmers, Persian craftsmen, Arab merchants, and European artisans. The transformation was already beginning. In the grand councils where military strategy was planned, voices now spoke in dozens of languages. Maps spread across tables depicted regions that extended from Pacific shores to Mediterranean coastlines. The empire that had begun as a collection of Mongol tribes was becoming something that transcended any single culture or tradition. It was becoming, in the truest sense, a world empire whose influence would reshape the course of human history as the sun set over the conquered cities of Central Asia. Its fading light illuminated banners that bore the symbols of unity that Genghis Khan had forged from the chaos of tribal warfare. The steps that had given birth to his vision now seemed small compared to the vastness of the empire that vision had created. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new territories to govern, new peoples to integrate into the Mongol system. But tonight, as the Khan surveyed the greatest extent of conquest the world had yet seen, he could reflect on how completely the reality had exceeded even his most ambitious dreams. The boy who had been born as Temujin into a world of endless tribal warfare had become the architect of an empire that spanned continents and would endure for generations yet to come. The golden threads of administrative genius wove themselves through every corner of the expanding empire, binding distant lands with invisible cords of efficiency and order. In the great capital of Karakoram, now rising from the steppes like a jewel cast upon felt, scribes from a dozen kingdoms bent over, their tablets translating the Khan's will into languages that had never before carried Mongol words. The rhythm of governance had become as natural as breathing, each decree flowing outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, reaching the farthest shores of the known world. Time, that most persistent of conquerors, began to lay its gentle but inexorable claim upon the great Khan's shoulders. The man who had once ridden for days without rest now found himself pausing more often to gaze across the endless grasslands, his weathered hands resting upon the pommel of his saddle as memories danced like heat mirages in the distance. The years had carved deep lines around his eyes, not merely the marks of age, but the accumulated weight of 1,000 decisions, each one rippling outward to touch the lives of millions. His hair, once black as a raven's wing, had turned the color of winter clouds, though his eyes retained their fierce clarity. The body that had endured countless battles, endless rides across frozen tundra and burning desert, began to speak in whispers of mortality. Yet within this aging frame burned a mind sharper than any sword his smiths had ever forged, a strategic intelligence that had not dimmed but deepened with experience, like wine that grows richer in the cellar of years. The empire he had built stretched beyond the horizon of any single man's comprehension. From the shores of the Black Sea to the walls of Beijing, from the forests of Siberia to the deserts of Persia, his name was spoken in 100 tongues. Yet with each passing season, the Khan found himself drawn not to new conquests, but to the delicate art of preservation, how to ensure that what had been built would endure beyond the span of any single life, how to plant seeds that would grow into forests long after the gardener had returned to dust. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the camp lay wrapped in the deep silence of the steppe, Genghis Khan would often walk alone among the sleeping warriors. His footsteps made no sound on the frost-covered grass, and his breathing formed small clouds in the cold air. These were moments of profound solitude, when the weight of leadership pressed heaviest upon his soul. Here, in the democracy of sleep, emperor and archer lay equally vulnerable to the night, equally dependent upon the same cold stars for light. The Khan's thoughts during these nocturnal wanderings turned increasingly to the nature of legacy. What did it mean to leave something behind that would outlast flesh and bone? His sons were grown men now, each commanding armies, each governing vast territories. Yet he saw in them the same fierce ambition that had driven him, the same hunger for conquest that might tear apart what had been so carefully woven together. The empire was like a great tapestry, beautiful in its complexity, but fragile if the threads were pulled in different directions. The Western Shia kingdom, nestled in the corridor between the Gobi Desert and the Tibetan Plateau, had become more than a mere target of conquest, had become a symbol of unfinished business, a thorn in the side of Mongol pride. This kingdom, with its sophisticated irrigation systems and fortress cities, had dared to refuse tribute, to close its borders to Mongol merchants, to stand as a defiant island in the rising sea of the Khan's dominion. The decision to launch what would prove to be his final campaign was made not in anger, but with the cold calculation of a master strategist who understood that weakness perceived as strength diminished. The preparation for this campaign took on an almost ritualistic quality, as if the great Khan sensed that this would be his last dance with the god of war. Every detail was scrutinized with the attention of a craftsman creating his masterpiece. Supply lines were established with mathematical precision. Siege engines were constructed with innovations gleaned from Chinese engineers, and the movement of troops was choreographed like a vast, deadly ballet across the landscape, as the Mongol army moved south toward the Shire territories. The Khan rode at its head with the same upright bearing that had marked his presence on 1,000 battlefields. Yet those closest to him noticed subtle changes, the way he would sometimes pause to watch a hawk circling overhead, the manner in which his gaze would linger on the play of light across the mountains, as if he were memorizing the beauty of the world he had spent his life conquering. The siege of Zhongxing, the Shire capital, became a masterclass in the evolution of Mongol warfare. Gone were the days of simple cavalry charges and terror tactics. The Khan's forces employed sophisticated siege techniques, undermining walls with the patience of miners, redirecting rivers to flood defensive positions, and using psychological warfare with the precision of a surgeon's blade. The city's defenders, brave though they were, found themselves facing not just an army, but an entire system of war that had been refined through decades of conquest. Yet even as the siege progressed with inexorable efficiency, the Khan's health began to fail. The years of hard riding, sleeping on frozen ground, and bearing the crushing weight of command had taken their toll. His body, which had seemed invincible for so long, began to whisper of mortality. Fever came and went, like an unwelcome visitor, and there were days when his advisors watched anxiously as he struggled to maintain the composure that had been his hallmark. Despite his failing health, the Khan's mind remained sharp as winter wind. He continued to direct the siege operations with the same attention to detail that had marked all his campaigns. His understanding of human nature, honed through decades of leadership, allowed him to anticipate the defenders' moves with uncanny accuracy. When the Shire King finally sent envoys to negotiate surrender, the Khan's terms were as precise and unforgiving as mathematics' complete submission, vast tribute, and the integration of Shire military forces into the Mongol war machine. The fall of Zhongxing marked more than the end of a kingdom. It represented the completion of a circle. The boy who had once hidden in the marshes from his enemies had become the man who could bring entire civilizations to their knees. Yet, in this moment of triumph, the Khan felt not exultation, but a profound weariness, as if the victory had drained the last reserves of his strength. The campaign that was meant to be a capstone to his career had become something else entirely, a final proof of his mortal limitations. In the summer of 1227, as the conquest of Western Shire neared its completion, the great Khan made a decision that would echo through the corridors of history. He called for a great Kurultai, a gathering of the most important nobles and generals of the empire, to convene beneath the sacred peak of Berken-Calden. This mountain, which had sheltered him in his youth and witnessed his first prayers to the eternal blue sky, would now serve as the stage for his most crucial performance, the orchestration of his succession. The journey to Berken-Calden was undertaken despite the Khan's deteriorating health, a pilgrimage that took on spiritual significance for the entire empire. As the great procession wound its way across the steppes, with horses and wagons stretching beyond the horizon, it seemed as if the very earth itself was paying homage to the man who had reshaped the world. The mountain stood waiting, its peaks crowned with snow even in the heat of summer, a reminder that some things endured beyond the ambitions of mortal men. The Kurultai that assembled at the foot of Berken-Calden was unlike any gathering in human history. Princes from conquered kingdoms sat beside Mongol nobles. Chinese administrators shared counsel with Persian scholars, and warriors from a dozen different cultures found common ground in their loyalty to the Khan. The diversity of the assembly was itself a testament to the scope of the empire, a living map of conquest written in the faces and voices of those who had chosen to serve rather than perish. The question of succession had haunted the Khan's thoughts for years. His sons were capable leaders, each with their own strengths and territories, but they were also fierce competitors whose ambitions might tear the empire apart. Joki, his eldest, commanded the Western territories, but lived under the shadow of questions about his legitimacy. Chagatai was a strict traditionalist whose devotion to Mongol customs was absolute. Gadai possessed the diplomatic skills and even temperament that might serve an empire better than a conqueror. Tolui, the youngest, was perhaps the most gifted military commander, but also the most likely to prioritize war over administration. The Khan's decision, when it came, surprised many but revealed the depth of his understanding of both human nature and the needs of empire. He chose Gedai as his successor, not because he was the strongest warrior or the fiercest conqueror, but because he possessed the qualities necessary to hold together what had been built. The empire needed not another conqueror but a consolidator, not another destroyer of cities but a builder of institutions. In Gedai, the Khan saw the patience and wisdom necessary to transform a collection of conquered territories into a stable, enduring realm. The announcement was made in the traditional manner, with the Khan standing before the assembled nobles, and speaking in the clear, carrying voice that had commanded armies and negotiated with kings. His words were simple but profound. The empire needs a ruler who can hold water in his cupped hands without letting it slip through his fingers. The metaphor was understood by Al-Conquest was like grasping water, easy to seize but difficult to hold. The skills required for each were different, and the time for pure conquest was passing. But succession involved more than simply naming an heir. The Khan spent long hours with his chosen successor, sharing not just the mechanics of rule, but the deeper wisdom he had accumulated over a lifetime of leadership. These conversations, conducted in the shadow of the sacred mountain, covered everything, from the management of diverse populations to the delicate balance between fear and respect that kept an empire stable. The Khan spoke of the weight of decision, the loneliness of command, and the necessity of sometimes choosing between what was right and what was necessary to his other sons. The Khan assigned specific roles that would allow them to serve the empire while minimizing the potential for conflict. Chagatai would oversee the application of Mongol law throughout the realm, ensuring that the traditional values that had forged the empire would not be forgotten. Tolui would command the homeland armies, maintaining the military strength that was the foundation of Mongol power. Even in division, the Khan sought unity, creating a system where each brother's strength would support rather than threaten the whole. Among the most enduring achievements of the great Khan's later years was the codification of the Yasa, the great law code that would govern the Mongol Empire long after its creator had passed into legend. This was not merely a collection of rules and punishments, but a comprehensive system of governance that reflected the Khan's understanding of human nature and the requirements of empire. The Yasa represented the distillation of decades of experience in ruling diverse populations, each with their own customs, beliefs, and traditions. The creation of the Yasa was a painstaking process that involved consultations with scholars, administrators, and military leaders from across the empire. The Khan understood that effective law must be both universal and flexible, capable of maintaining order while adapting to local conditions. The code addressed everything from military organization and diplomatic protocol to trade regulations and religious tolerance. Its provisions reflected the practical wisdom of a ruler who had learned that sustainable conquest required not just the ability to destroy, but the capacity to build. One of the most revolutionary aspects of the Yasa was its emphasis on religious tolerance. In an age when religious differences were often grounds for war, The Mongol legal code explicitly protected the rights of all believers, whether they followed Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, or the traditional shamanic practices of the steppes. This tolerance was not born of indifference, but of strategic wisdom. The Khan had learned that diversity of thought strengthened rather than weakened his empire, bringing together the best minds and practices from many cultures. The Yasa also established the principle of merit-based advancement that had been a hallmark of Mongol society from its earliest days. Position and privilege were to be earned through service and ability, rather than inherited through birth. This meritocracy had been one of the key factors in the empire's rapid expansion, as talented individuals from conquered territories found themselves welcomed into the highest levels of administration and military command. The codification of this principle ensured that the empire would continue to benefit from the talents of all its subjects. The Khan's attention to detail in crafting the Yasa extended to the most practical aspects of governance. Trade routes were protected by law, with severe penalties for those who would rob or molest merchants. The postal system that connected the far-flung territories of the empire was given legal protection, ensuring that information and commands could flow freely across vast distances. Standards for weights and measures were established, creating a common commercial language that facilitated trade and taxation. Perhaps most importantly, the Yasa established the principle of collective responsibility that bound the empire together. Communities were held accountable for the actions of their members, creating a social structure where order was maintained not just through fear of punishment, but through mutual obligation. This system recognized that stable governance required the active participation of the governed, that subjects who had a stake in maintaining order were more valuable than those who submitted only through force. The promulgation of the Yasa throughout the empire was undertaken with the same systematic thoroughness that had characterized the Khan's military campaigns. Copies of the code were distributed to governors and administrators in every corner of the realm, translated into local languages, while maintaining the essential meaning of the original. Schools were established to train a new generation of legal scholars, who could interpret and apply the law consistently across the diverse territories of the empire. The Khan took particular pride in the sections of the Yasa that dealt with the treatment of women and children, drawing from his own experiences of hardship and displacement. The code provided protections for the most vulnerable members of society. Women were granted property rights and legal standing that was remarkably progressive for its time. Children were assured of education and protection, reflecting the Khan's understanding that the future of the empire depended on the proper nurturing of its youngest members. As the autumn of 1227 settled over the steppes, the great Khan's strength continued to ebb like a tide slowly retreating from the shore. The man who had once seemed indestructible now moved with the careful deliberation of one who felt the weight of every step. His inner circle, the trusted advisors and generals who had shared his triumph and burden, watched with growing concern as their leader's vitality faded like the last light of day. Yet even in his weakening state, the Khan's mind remained clear, his judgment sharp, his vision for the empire's future unwavering. The final weeks of the Khan's life were spent in the place he had always loved most: the open steppes beneath, the endless sky, He had returned to the heartland of his people, to the grasslands where he had learned to ride and hunt, where he had first dreamed of uniting the scattered tribes into something greater than the sum of their parts. Here, surrounded by the familiar sounds of horses and the whisper of wind through grass, he found a peace that had eluded him through decades of war and conquest. His final conversations with his sons and closest advisors took on the quality of a testament, each word chosen with the precision of a craftsman selecting stones for a foundation that must endure for centuries. He spoke of the importance of unity, of the dangers that would arise if the empire fragmented into competing kingdoms. His voice, though weakened by illness, carried the authority of absolute conviction as he impressed upon his successors the sacred duty they bore to preserve what had been built. The Khan's thoughts in these final days often turned to the ordinary people of his empire, the farmers and herders, the craftsmen and merchants, the soldiers and scholars who had placed their trust in his leadership. He had never forgotten that an empire was not built from the top down, but from the bottom up, that the strength of any realm lay not in its palaces, but in its people. His greatest satisfaction came not from remembering the cities he had conquered, but from envisioning the prosperity that would flow from the peace he had imposed. The manner of the Khan's death, when it came, was as shrouded in mystery as much of his life had been. Some accounts speak of fever, others of injuries sustained in a fall from his horse. What remained consistent in all tellings was the dignity with which he faced his final moments, the absence of fear or regret that might have marked the passing of a lesser man. He died as he had lived on his own terms, surrounded by those who had shared his vision and sacrifice. The reaction to news of the Khan's death rippled across the empire like waves from a stone thrown into still water. In the capitals of conquered kingdoms, in the markets of distant cities, in the yurts of nomadic herders, people paused in their daily activities to contemplate the passing of a man who had reshaped their world. For some, it was a moment of liberation. For others, a time of uncertainty about what the future might hold. But for all, it marked the end of an era, the closing of a chapter in the great book of human history. The funeral arrangements reflected both the man's greatness and his deep connection to the traditions of his people. His body was transported to a secret location in the heartland of Mongolia, where it was laid to rest according to ancient custom. No great monument marked the grave, no elaborate tomb proclaimed his achievements to future generations. Instead, the burial site was deliberately obscured, allowing the great Khan to return to the earth as simply as any herder or warrior. His final resting place, known only to the eternal sky that had watched over his entire life, the secrecy surrounding the burial was itself a final strategic masterstroke, by ensuring that his grave could never become a pilgrimage site or a symbol for enemies to destroy. The Khan guaranteed that his legacy would live not in stone and earth, but in the institutions he had created, the laws he had established, and the empire he had built. His true monument was not buried in the ground, but written across the map of the world, inscribed in the memories of the millions whose lives he had touched, and embedded in the very structure of the civilization he had forged from the raw materials of tribal warfare and nomadic tradition. As news of the Khan's death spread throughout the empire, his final command was carried out with the same precision that had marked all his orders. The transition of power to Gedai proceeded smoothly, a testament to the careful planning and clear communication that had characterized the succession process. The empire that had been built through conquest would now be tested by the more subtle challenges of governance and administration. But the foundations laid by the great Khan proved strong enough to bear the weight of future generations. The wheel of history continued to turn, but it would forever bear the mark of the man who had given it such tremendous force and direction. The great Khan felt the burden of decades settling upon his shoulders like winter snow upon the steppes. Each morning brought reminders that even the most powerful of men remained subject to the passage of time. His hands, once steady enough to draw a bow with devastating accuracy, now trembled slightly as he held the reins of his beloved horse. The body that had endured countless battles, survived assassination attempts, and weathered the harshest conditions nature could devise, began to show the inevitable signs of mortality. In the year 1227, as spring gave way to summer across the vast empire he had forged, Genghis Khan found himself contemplating the great wheel of existence that turned ceaselessly beneath the eternal blue sky. He was approximately 65 years old, though the exact year of his birth remained as mysterious as many aspects of his early life. The campaigns had taken their toll, not merely in the accumulation of physical wounds and scars, but in the deeper weariness that comes to those who have borne the weight of impossible decisions. The Western Shia campaign, his final military endeavor, proceeded with the methodical efficiency that had become the hallmark of Mongol warfare. Yet those closest to the Khan noticed changes in his demeanor. Where once he had ridden at the front of every charge, now he more often directed operations from positions that offered broader tactical views. His tactical genius remained undiminished, but his body demanded accommodations that his iron will had long refused to acknowledge. During the siege of the Western Shire capital, witnesses reported that the Khan spent long hours in contemplation, gazing across the landscape that stretched endlessly toward horizons that seemed to call to something deep within his spirit. The shamans who had served him since his youth noticed that his attention turned increasingly toward matters of the spirit world, toward questions of legacy and the continuation of the great work he had begun. The exact circumstances of Genghis Khan's death remain shrouded in the mists of history, deliberately obscured by those who served him. Some accounts suggest he died from injuries sustained in a fall from his horse during a hunting expedition. Others propose that illness, perhaps the same fever that had plagued him periodically throughout his life, finally claimed him. Still other sources hint at injuries received during the siege operations against Western Shire, where even in his advanced years, the Khan could not resist participating directly in the action that had defined his existence. What historians agree upon is that Genghis Khan died in August of 1227. In his tent, surrounded by his most trusted advisors and family members, the great heart that had driven an empire spanning from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea finally fell silent, its last beats echoing the rhythm of hoofbeats that had carried Mongol warriors across the known world. The immediate aftermath of his death revealed the depth of planning and foresight that had characterized his entire reign. Even in death, Genghis Khan had prepared for the continuation of his empire. The succession had been carefully arranged, with his third son, Gedai, designated as the Great Khan. A choice that balanced military capability with administrative wisdom. The other sons received their designated portions of the empire, creating a system that would, for a time, maintain the unity and strength of the Mongol Confederation. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Genghis Khan's death was not the event itself, but the extraordinary measures taken to conceal it from the world. The secrecy surrounding his final moments and burial reflected both the Mongol understanding of spiritual power and the practical necessities of maintaining imperial stability. During a vulnerable transition period, the burial of Genghis Khan became one of history's most enduring mysteries, a secret so well kept that nearly 8 centuries later, archaeologists and historians continue their search for the final resting place of the world's greatest conqueror. The elaborate measures taken to conceal his tomb reflected not only Mongol religious beliefs about the sanctity of burial sites, but also the practical understanding that the great Khan's grave might become a target for desecration by his enemies, or a pilgrimage site that could destabilize the empire. According to the most reliable historical accounts, a select group of the Khan's most trusted warriors undertook the solemn responsibility of transporting his body to its final resting place. The exact location was known only to this inner circle, men who had sworn the most sacred oaths to carry the secret to their own graves. The burial party traveled under cover of darkness, following routes that avoided populated areas and main trade paths. Legend suggests that the funeral procession made its way toward the region of the Khan's birth, somewhere in the sacred Börte mountain area, where the young Temujin had once hidden from his enemies and where he had experienced the spiritual revelations that would guide his rise to power. The symbolism of returning the great conqueror to the land of his origins held deep meaning within Mongol cosmology, representing the completion of a great circle and the return of his spirit to the eternal blue sky that had watched over his remarkable journey. The burial itself was conducted according to ancient Mongol traditions, but on a scale befitting the founder of the greatest empire the world had ever known. Historical accounts vary, but most suggest that the Khan was interred with items that reflected both his earthly achievements and his spiritual beliefs, weapons that had served him in crucial battles, ornaments that symbolized his imperial authority, and objects of personal significance were placed with him to accompany his spirit on its journey to the next world. The most chilling aspect of the burial preparations involved the lengths to which the Mongols went to preserve the secret. According to several historical sources, everyone who witnessed the funeral procession or participated in the burial was killed, ensuring that no living soul could reveal the location. Even the soldiers who killed the witnesses were themselves executed, creating a chain of death that guaranteed absolute secrecy. The horses that had transported the burial party were reportedly slaughtered, and even the ground above the grave was trampled by herds of horses to eliminate any trace that might mark the site. Some accounts describe the diversion of a river to flow over the burial site, a final concealment that would make discovery virtually impossible even for those who might guess the general area. This extraordinary effort to hide the tomb reflects the Mongol belief that disturbing the rest of such a powerful spirit could bring catastrophic consequences not only to the perpetrators, but to the world itself. The secrecy was so complete that, within a generation, even members of the imperial family had lost precise knowledge of the grave's location. This may have been intentional, ensuring that future political upheavals or family disputes could never lead to the desecration of the founder's remains. The burial became not just a physical concealment, but a spiritual protection, wrapping the Great Khan's final rest in layers of mystery that time would only deepen. Modern archaeological efforts have utilized satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and other advanced technologies in attempts to locate the tomb, but the Mongol strategic genius that characterized Genghis Khan's life apparently extended to his death preparations. The secret remains intact, perhaps exactly as he would have wished, allowing his spirit to rest undisturbed, while his legend continues to grow across the centuries. The death of Genghis Khan marked not the end of the Mongol Empire, but rather its transformation into something even more vast and influential than what the great Khan himself had directly controlled. The succession system he had established proved remarkably effective, allowing for the continuation of expansion and the development of governmental structures that would influence world history for centuries to come. Genghis Khan, the designated successor, proved himself worthy of his father's confidence. Under his leadership, the Mongol Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching from Korea in the east to Hungary in the west, encompassing more than 24 million square kilometers and controlling the destinies of peoples as diverse as Chinese scholars and European knights, Persian poets and Russian princes. The administrative innovations that Genghis Khan had begun were expanded and refined by his successors. The Yam, the postal relay system that had facilitated communication across vast distances, became an intricate network that enabled rapid message transmission from Beijing to Baghdad. This system, which required the maintenance of thousands of way stations and the dedication of countless horses and riders, represented perhaps the world's first truly international communication network. Trade flourished under Mongol protection in ways that would have seemed impossible during the fragmented warfare of earlier periods. The Silk Road, that ancient artery of commerce connecting east and west, experienced a golden age of security and prosperity. Merchants could travel from Venice to Karakoram with unprecedented safety, carrying not only goods but ideas, technologies, and cultural innovations that would transform societies across the known world. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, became a reality across much of Eurasia. This period of relative stability allowed for exchanges of knowledge that accelerated human progress in remarkable ways. Chinese innovations like gunpowder and printing technology spread westward, while Islamic, mathematical, and astronomical knowledge traveled eastward. European cartographic techniques, combined with Asian navigation methods, and medical knowledge from various traditions, merged to create new understanding of human health and disease. The empire's religious tolerance, established by Genghis Khan's pragmatic approach to spiritual diversity, continued under his successors and created unprecedented opportunities for interfaith dialogue and exchange. Christian missionaries found audiences in the Mongol courts. Islamic scholars engaged in debates with Buddhist monks, and shamanistic traditions influenced the development of syncretic religious movements that bridged different spiritual worlds. However, the very success of the empire contained the seeds of its eventual transformation. The vast territories required different approaches to governance, leading to the gradual development of distinct Khanates that, while nominally unified, began to develop their own characters and interests. The Yuan dynasty in China, established by Kublai Khan, became increasingly Chinese in character. The Ilkhanate in Persia adopted Islamic culture and Persian administrative traditions. The Golden Horde in Russia developed its own relationships with Orthodox Christian populations and European neighbors. The cultural impact of Mongol rule extended far beyond political control. The movement of peoples, voluntary and involuntary, created new ethnic and cultural combinations that enriched the human tapestry. Cities like Baghdad, Kiev, and Moscow were rebuilt with influences from across the empire. Architectural styles merged, creating unique hybrids that reflected the cosmopolitan nature of Mongol rule. As decades passed into centuries, the historical figure of Genghis Khan began to merge with legend and myth, creating a complex legacy that transcended the boundaries of any single culture or historical period. The man who had once been Temujin, the boy who had struggled for survival on the harsh steppes, became a symbol that different peoples interpreted according to their own experiences and needs. In Mongolia, Genghis Khan's memory evolved into something approaching the divine. He became not merely a historical ruler, but a spiritual father of the nation, a figure whose blessing was invoked for everything from military campaigns to agricultural endeavors. Mongolian shamans incorporated his spirit into their cosmology, and his image appeared in the sacred narratives that passed from generation to generation around the fires of herder camps. The secret history of the Mongols, compiled in the decades following his death, presented a complex portrait that balanced the ruthless conqueror with the wise lawgiver, the brutal warrior with the caring father. This text, written in the Mongolian script that Genghis Khan had commissioned, preserved not only the facts of his life, but also the cultural context that had shaped his worldview and decisions. Chinese historians, despite the trauma of Mongol conquest, gradually developed a more nuanced view of the great Khan's legacy. Confucian scholars, initially horrified by the disruption of traditional order, eventually recognized the administrative innovations and legal reforms that had emerged from Mongol rule. The Yuan dynasty, though foreign in origin, was eventually incorporated into the traditional Chinese historical cycle, with Genghis Khan acknowledged as the founder of a legitimate dynasty. Islamic historians presented perhaps the most complex relationship with Genghis Khan's memory. The destruction of Baghdad and other centers of Islamic civilization created a wound in collective memory that persisted for centuries. Yet Islamic scholars also recognized the ultimate conversion of many Mongol rulers to Islam and the role that the empire had played in spreading Islamic culture to new regions. The ambivalent relationship reflected the deep trauma of conquest balanced against the eventual integration of Mongol and Islamic traditions. European perspectives on Genghis Khan evolved dramatically over time. Medieval chroniclers, terrified by reports of Mongol invasions, portrayed him as an apocalyptic figure, a scourge sent by God to punish Christian sins. Renaissance historians began to view him more analytically, recognizing his military genius and administrative capabilities. Enlightenment thinkers sometimes held him up as an example of natural law triumph over decadent civilization, while Romantic writers found in his story themes of individual will transcending circumstances. The influence of Genghis Khan's example extended to later conquerors and empire builders who consciously modeled aspects of their campaigns on Mongol precedents. Napoleon studied Mongol military tactics and organizational methods. British colonial administrators in India borrowed elements from Mongol legal and administrative systems. Even in the modern era, military strategists continue to analyze the campaigns that established the world's largest contiguous empire. Perhaps most remarkably, genetic studies in the late 20th and early 21st centuries revealed the extraordinary biological legacy of Genghis Khan and his close male relatives. Researchers discovered that a significant percentage of men across Central Asia carry Y chromosome markers that appear to derive from a common ancestor living in Mongolia during the time of the Great Khan. This genetic signature, found in populations from Kazakhstan to Korea, represents perhaps the most tangible evidence of the empire's demographic impact. The cities that Genghis Khan had ordered destroyed eventually rose again, often incorporating elements that reflected their Mongol period. The trade routes that Mongol protection had secured continued to shape economic relationships long after the empire's political unity had dissolved. The legal concepts that had emerged from the Great Yasa influenced legal traditions across Eurasia, contributing to the development of international law and diplomatic practices that remain relevant today. The influence of Genghis Khan and the empire he founded extends into the contemporary world in ways both obvious and subtle, weaving through the fabric of modern international relations. Military strategy, cultural exchange, and even genetic inheritance. The patterns established during the 13th century continue to shape human civilization nearly 8 centuries after the Great Khan's death. Modern Mongolia has embraced Genghis Khan as the foundational figure of national identity. Following the end of communist rule and the establishment of democratic government, Mongolia experienced a remarkable revival of interest in its imperial heritage. The Great Khan's image appears on currency. His name graces the country's major airport, and his mounted statue, towering 40 meters above the steppes east of Ulaanbaatar, has become a pilgrimage site for Mongolians seeking connection with their ancestral greatness. The legal innovations introduced during Genghis Khan's reign contributed to concepts that modern international law takes for granted. The principle of diplomatic immunity, the idea of religious tolerance as state policy, and the notion that law should apply equally regardless of social status, all found early expression in the Great Yasa. While these concepts developed through many cultural traditions, the Mongol contribution represents one of the earliest attempts to create legal frameworks for governing diverse multi-ethnic populations across vast territories. Military strategists continue to study Mongol tactics and organizational methods. The emphasis on mobility, intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, and decentralized command structures appears in modern military doctrine around the world. The Mongol concept of incorporating useful technologies and personnel from conquered territories presaged modern approaches to military innovation and international cooperation. The economic legacy of the Mongol Empire appears in the modern understanding of globalization and international trade, the protection of trade routes, the standardization of weights and measures, and the creation of credit systems that functioned across vast distances, all anticipated elements of the modern global economy. The Mongol approach to managing cultural diversity while maintaining political unity offers lessons for contemporary multicultural societies and international organizations. Archaeological research continues to reveal new aspects of Mongol influence on material culture. Excavations across Eurasia uncover artifacts that demonstrate the extent of cultural exchange during the Mongol period. Chinese porcelain found in medieval European sites, Islamic metalwork discovered in Mongolian ruins, and European textiles preserved in Central Asian burials all testify to the remarkable integration that Mongol rule achieved. The environmental impact of Mongol conquests and subsequent demographic changes has become a subject of scientific investigation. Some researchers suggest that the massive reduction in agricultural populations during the initial conquests led to reforestation that may have affected global climate patterns. The abandonment of cultivated lands and the return to nomadic herding in some regions created changes that persisted for centuries, influencing everything from soil composition to wildlife populations. Literature and popular culture continue to draw inspiration from the Genghis Khan story. Modern novels, films, and television productions regularly revisit the themes of his life: the rise from obscurity to world-changing power, the tension between civilization and barbarism, the cost of empire building, and the question of how history should judge figures who combine remarkable achievements with immense destruction. Academic scholarship has increasingly moved beyond simple moral judgments to examine the complex realities of Mongol rule. Historians now recognize that the traditional narrative of pure destruction followed by civilization was overly simplified. The Mongols were simultaneously destroyers and preservers, innovators and traditionalists, cosmopolitan empire builders and fierce tribal warriors. This nuanced understanding reflects broader changes in historical methodology and the recognition that historical figures must be understood within their own cultural contexts, rather than judged solely by contemporary standards. The genetic legacy. Studies that began in the 1990s continue to yield remarkable results. The Y chromosome lineage associated with Genghis Khan and his family appears in populations across an area larger than any historical empire, suggesting that the biological impact of Mongol expansion was even more extensive than the political conquests. This genetic signature provides a unique form of historical evidence that supplements traditional documentary and archaeological sources. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the steppes lie silver beneath the stars, and the wind carries whispers of ancient hoofbeats, something of Genghis Khan's presence still moves across the landscape that shaped him. The boy who became Temujin, who transformed into the universal ruler, who died as the master of the world's greatest empire, has become something more than history can contain. His name echoes in the genealogies of modern families scattered across 2 continents. His legal principles appear in international courts. His military strategies inform contemporary warfare. His vision of religious tolerance influences modern concepts of human rights. His understanding of cultural synthesis shapes approaches to globalization. The empire he built lasted only briefly in its original form, but its influence flows like an underground river through the centuries, emerging in unexpected places and times. The secret of his burial remains intact, perhaps forever, somewhere beneath the vast sky of Mongolia, in a place known only to the spirits and the eternal blue heaven. The great Khan rests in the silence he chose. His body has returned to the earth of his birth, but his legacy lives in the altered trajectory of human civilization itself. The wind that once carried the dust of his armies now carries the pollen of flowers that bloom where cities once burned. The rivers that reflected the fires of conquest now watered the fields of peoples whose ancestors knew the thunder of Mongol horses. The mountains that witnessed the rise of the greatest conqueror in human history stand unchanged, eternal sentinels over a world he helped to create. Time flows like the great rivers he crossed in conquest, carrying away the immediate pain of his wars while preserving the deeper changes he brought to the world. The bridges he built between East and West still carry the traffic of ideas and innovations. The legal traditions he established still influence the governance of nations. The genetic inheritance he left continues to shape the human story. In the end, Genghis Khan achieved a form of immortality that few conquerors have known. Not the false immortality of monuments that crumble or dynasties that fade, but the true persistence that comes from altering the fundamental patterns of human development. He became part of the infrastructure of civilization itself, woven so deeply into the fabric of history that his influence will continue as long as human beings remember their past and dream of their future. The steppes remember him in the rhythm of seasons and the migration of herds. The cities remember him in their walls and streets. The peoples of Eurasia remember him in their blood and their laws, their languages and their dreams. He is present in the possibility of communication between distant cultures, in the idea that merit can triumph over birth, in the understanding that the world is one great country under one eternal sky. Somewhere in the vast silence of Mongolia, where the grass grows over secrets and the wind keeps its own counsel, the greatest of all earthly rulers sleeps in the embrace of the earth that made him. His name has joined the wind and the stars, becoming part of the eternal song that the steppes sing to those who have the patience to listen. The universal ruler has found his place in the universe, and the universe bears his mark forever. Thank you for joining this historical journey. If these timeless tales have moved you, helped you find peaceful sleep, or sparked your curiosity about the vast tapestry of human history, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these carefully crafted historical narratives to life. Like this video if it brought you peace, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe for more immersive journeys through the corridors of time. Let us together keep the great stories of humanity alive for future generations to discover and cherish. Sweet dreams, and may history's greatest tales guide you to peaceful rest.